Welcome back. At the end of last segment, we talked about 1982 being a critical year, and I also mentioned that by that time the Maronite leader Bashar Gemayel, who had become president, was aligning himself with Israel. So at the very end, I talked about Israel's power relative to the Arab neighbors. And I also mentioned that Ariel Sharon had the vision of creating the greater Israel, and to him that meant the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. So we ended by talking about, very briefly, about Sharon option. So I want to resume that discussion. The idea of Sharon was to expel the Palestinian from the West Bank to Jordan, and also to help the Lebanese Maronites, especially Bashar Gemayel, to expel the Palestinian from Lebanon, where they were causing a lot of problems, and they could raid into Israel from Lebanon into Jordan. So in essence, the Sharon option meant that Jordan would become the Palestinian homeland, and not necessarily under King Hussein of Jordan, but it could have its own Palestinian leadership. So the solution for him was very simple. Jordan is Palestine, and the West, excluding the West Bank, and the West Bank becomes part of Israel. There is no reason, if they have a homeland for Palestinian, to stay in Lebanon either, so they all move in there, and if King Hussein has to go, so be it. Interestingly, I want to make a parenthetical note that Ariel Sharon, Hafiz al-Assad, and also Anwar al-Sadat are the kind of leaders that they pretty much tell you in their speeches what they think. By contrast, King Hussein of Jordan, he is very circumspect, and he really doesn't, you can listen to him for about 2 hours and not be sure what exactly was he talking about, because he could go all over the map without really stating what he wants to, what he really believes. So meanwhile, as I said, Bashar Gemayel, the leader of the Lebanese forces and now the president of Lebanon, joined forces with Israel, and they have a plan worked out. So on June 6, 1982, Israel invades Lebanon, a civil war, and invades Lebanon and enters the civil war in support of the Maronites. It's known as Operation Peace of Galilee. So in 1982, you have Israeli really actually occupying the southern Lebanon and actually moving all the way into Beirut. So in September 14 of 1982, what we get is the assassination of Bashar Gemayel, and when he gets killed, really one of the most capable leader for Maronite is gone, and he's going to get succeeded by his brother Amin Gemayel, but Amin is nowhere as charismatic or as capable of Bashir, and that is a big, big blow to the Maronite cause and to the Israeli strategy. And as you can imagine, the Maronites are really deeply angered by what happened, because this was a car bomb in which Bashar Gemayel is torn apart. So 4 days later, we have one of those horrible things that everyone had predicted that could happen in a civil war, and that is we have the massacre of the Palestinian at the Sabra and Shatila camp. It's been estimated that close to somewhere between 1,000, at minimum being 700, the upper figure being 3,500 Palestinian refugees, men, women, and children, were murdered by the Maronite Lebanese force under the watchful eye of the Israeli soldiers who led them into the camp, knowing full well what to expect and keeping them there and letting them out. And in fact, Ariel Sharon was the man who was responsible for it, and Israeli court held him indirectly responsible, but everyone knows he was really the person who knew full well what would happen, so he really was directly responsible for it. So with that massacre, suddenly the Israel's plan is looking very frail and not workable. Their allies in Lebanon is gone, and so there is pressure on Israel to withdraw. In 1985, Israeli partially withdraw, but still they proclaim southern Lebanon as their security zone, and that security zone is going to last for many years, 22 years of occupation, from 1978, when they first moved there, all the way to 2000. So what you get out of this is that Israel quickly became overextended. They overestimated their capability, they underestimated the challenge, and in many ways Sharon was disgraced for allowing that what happened, although the trend in politics is that the most disgraced people can find a way of rehabilitating it, and the public accepts it. So later on, he'll come back and will become a prime minister of Israel once again. So it would be a good point now, because we're reaching pretty much the end of the Civil War, the Great Civil War, to compare the two civil wars to see what were the factors in common and what were the differences. So if you look at the two civil wars in terms of causes, the first one was the 1957-58, the very brief Civil War, and then the second one was the Great Civil War, lasting 15 years. So sectarian causes in the first case was partially true, but in the second case really was primarily a factor. It was a key factor, so it was really present. What about external factor? Poor Lebanon is always impacted by what is decided outside of its border. If you recall, in the case of the 1957-58, the first Civil War, the Eisenhower Doctrine was the triggering event, as far as the external factor were concerned. It signaled the anti-change leadership that the United States would like to maintain a kind of a condominium of the conservative leaders. In the case of the Great War, it was Sinai II that once again convinced the conservative leaders that the United States wants to maintain that status quo. As far as the anti-change resistance is concerned, it was a key factor in both conflict. In both conflict, people who didn't want change and didn't want to lose their established prerogatives to a new society, to a changed society, they resisted change and they used external powers to help them out. That was true in the first Civil War. It was also true in the second Civil War. Fourth was Palestinian. If you recall, Palestinians were not at all a factor during the first Civil War, but they certainly were a key factor. They were the main target during the Great Civil War. Finally, Israel. Israel was not a factor at all in the first Civil War, but it became a very important factor in the Great Civil War. So that pretty much wraps up the comparison of the two civil war. And so we can move on next to the ending of that civil war. And the ending of that civil war really was inaugurated with the Taif Agreement or Taif Accord, which was signed in October 22nd, 1989. So I want to talk briefly about the Taif Agreement and what it involved. It basically corrected the imbalance that existed in the 1943 National Pact. Remember, we had a 6/5 ratio in favor of Christian versus Muslim. That was scrapped in favor of equal number of Christians and Muslims. So what you see, therefore, power shift from Maronite to from Maronite president to both the prime minister, who is a Sunni, and to the parliament, who is headed by a Shiite. So that was one of the big changes that occurred. The other change, perhaps equally important, was that the Taif Agreement meant that the presence of Syria in Lebanon was judged not only as legitimate, but it was actually strengthened by acknowledging that Syria has a special role to play in both implementing the Taif Accord. So Syria has the charge of helping with the implementation of the Taif Accord and having influence in Lebanese politics. So next, what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about some of the key features of the Taif Agreement. And these include the following. First, we have a troika system of power sharing that really involves three quote-unquote presidents. There is the President of the Republic, Maronite, as 1943 had established it. But if you notice, we said that the power was shifted from the Prime Minister from the President to the Prime Minister. The second one is the President of the Council of Ministers, the Sunni person who is the Prime Minister. And the third is the President of the Chamber of Deputies, who happens to be always a Shiite. In terms of relative power shift, the power of the Maronite president declined, the power of the Prime Minister for the Council of Ministers increased, and the power of the President of Chamber of Deputies, the Shiite, also increased. So that was the first element in there. Second feature was, if you notice, a scraping of the 6/5 formula in favor of equal representation of Muslim and Christian in the short run. In the long run, this is still would be favorable to Maronite. So this is a short run solution. In the long run, what is to happen is for Muslim to have a bigger share. In terms of seat allocation as a result of the Taif Agreement, we have the following balance of seats. One refers to before Taif and after Taif. Before Taif Agreement, the Christian had total of 54 seats divided among the various confessions or sects, and Muslim had 45, for a total number of 99 seats in the Chamber of Deputies or the Parliament. After the Taif Agreement, they're supposed to be equal, so you got 64 seats allotted to the Christian and 64 seats allotted to the Muslim, for a total of 128 seats there. And then finally, in that period of post-Cold War period, after the Civil War, Syria's dominating influence in Lebanese politics was affirmed by the TAIF agreement, which I mentioned, and essentially it called for a kind of a loose federation of the two countries.